The distress signal hit the Vantara's comm array at 3:47 station time, punching through 3 layers of background radiation like a fist through wet paper. Dr. Kale Marin was awake because she was always awake at that hour, bent over a slide tray in the xenobiology lab with her magnification visor pulled down, and a cold cup of synthetic coffee growing a skin she would drink through anyway. The signal resolved into words before the bridge crew could even scramble. Varanthe Biological Survey Station 9. Crew Complement 41. Request immediate quarantine class assistance. Do not board without full Bioscan protocol. Repeat, do not board without full Bioscan protocol. Captain Tessick, a Drenari whose scaled hide shifted between charcoal and slate depending on his stress levels, pulled the Vantara off its scheduled transit route within 4 minutes. He called Kale to the bridge because she was the only crew member with a Class 7 xenobiological field certification, and because the Varanthe were not known for sending distress signals. They were known for solving their own problems with a cold, procedural efficiency that most species found either admirable or unsettling. For a Varanthe station to call for help meant that whatever was happening there had exceeded the parameters of a species whose entire cultural identity was built on the belief that all problems had parameters. Kale stood on the bridge and listened to the signal repeat. She was 38 years old, lean in the way that people who forget meals are lean, with hands that moved constantly adjusting equipment, tapping surfaces, pressing her thumbnails into the pads of her fingers in a rhythm she had never been able to stop. Her colleagues called it a tic. Kale called it thinking. She had been a xenobiologist for 14 years, 6 of them on deep survey ships, and she had learned that the body understood things before the mind caught up. When her hands moved faster, it meant something in the data was wrong, and her fingers were trying to find the shape of it before her brain could name it. Her hands were moving very fast now. Full Bioscan protocol, she said. That's not standard quarantine language. That's Varanthe biohazard containment terminology. Level 3. Tessick's hide went full slate, meaning they're not dealing with a pathogen. They're dealing with something that can pass a standard bioscan, something that looks right on the cellular level but isn't. The bridge went quiet. The Vantara was a mid-range survey vessel with a crew of 19, not a military ship, not a quarantine cruiser. They carried standard medical equipment in Kale's portable lab, which was excellent for cataloging alien microbiomes and entirely inadequate for containing anything that could fool a bioscan. We're the closest vessel, Tessick said. I know. By 7 hours. I know that too. Tessick's claws clicked against the arm of his command chair, the Drenari equivalent of Kale's finger pressing, a body trying to outrun a mind. Recommendations. Kale pressed her thumbnails into her finger pads hard enough to leave crescents. We go. We take every portable bioscan unit we have. We run full-spectrum cellular analysis on every living thing we encounter before we interact with it. And we don't trust a standard reading. If their standard scans can't catch it, we need to go deeper. How deep? Mitochondrial, maybe subcellular. I won't know until I see what we're dealing with. And if it's already in one of them when we board. If one of the 41 people over there has been replaced and we can't tell. Then we figure out how to tell. That's what I do, Captain. The Vantara made the jump. 43 minutes of transit, during which Kale returned to her lab and began preparing the equipment she hoped she wouldn't need. The deep tissue sampler, the subcellular analysis array, and a field kit that included 20 sterile lancets and a ceramic blade she had carried since her residency on Korath 4, where the senior xenobiologist had taught her that sometimes the best diagnostic tool was the willingness to draw your own blood. She had never used the blade for that purpose. She pressed her thumb against the flat of it, feeling the cool ceramic through her glove, and tried to imagine a reason she would ever have to. Varanthe Biological Survey Station 9 was a lattice of pale composite struts and translucent membrane panels, designed to let the light of the local star flood every corridor and workspace. It hung in orbit around a terrestrial world whose surface was a carpet of bioluminescent moss, and the reflected light gave the station's interior a permanent green-gold glow, as though everything inside it were suspended in shallow water. The design was intentional. The Varanthi were a photosynthetic species, tall, slender beings whose skin was layered with chloroplast analogs that converted light into supplemental energy. They built their stations the way flowers build petals, to catch every available photon. The docking collar sealed with a hiss that Kale felt in her teeth. She stood in the airlock with her Bioscan unit raised, the ceramic blade in her belt kit, and two of the Vantara's security staff behind her Ren, a quiet Tolek whose 4 arms each held a different piece of equipment, and Jessic, a junior Drenari whose hide was cycling through colors so fast it looked like interference patterns on a broken display. "Weapons?" Jessic asked. His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when their owners are concentrating very hard on keeping them that way. Kale shook her head. "If this is what I think it is, weapons won't help. You can't shoot something that looks exactly like the person standing next to you." Jessic's hide went from cycling to a flat, sick gray. He didn't ask what she thought it was. Some questions answered themselves in the asking. The inner airlock door opened. The corridor beyond was bright, flooded with the green-gold light, and empty. No greeting party, no decontamination team, no sound except the station's atmospheric processors cycling air that smelled faintly of chlorophyll, and something else, something metallic and sweet that Kale's nose flagged before her instruments did. She cataloged the scent automatically. Organic decomposition products, trace copper compounds, the chemical signature of stressed Varanthi biology. 6 days of fear, metabolized and exhaled into the air. "Bioscan," she said. "Everything, walls, air, deck plating. If it has a cell, I want to see it." Ren deployed the portable array from 2 of his 4 arms while the other 2 held a specimen containment kit and a backup scanner. The readings came back clean. Standard atmospheric composition for a Varanthi station. No biological contaminants in the air. No anomalous cellular material on surfaces. Clean, clean, clean. Kale's hands pressed harder. Clean wasn't safe. Clean was the problem. If what they were hunting could pass a bioscan, then clean meant nothing except that the lie was good enough. They found the first Varanthi crew member in the primary laboratory, 17 meters from the airlock. She was standing at a workstation, her long photosynthetic fingers resting on a console that displayed cellular analysis data. She turned when they entered, and her face arranged itself into the precise configuration that Varanthi used to express professional acknowledgement, a slight tilt of the cranial ridge, a narrowing of the secondary optical membranes. "Dr. Marin," the Varanthi said. Her voice was calm, modulated, exactly correct. "I am Senior Researcher Thessaly. Thank you for responding to our signal." Kale raised the bioscan unit. "I need to scan you before we proceed." "Of course, I would expect nothing less." The scan took 11 seconds. Thessaly's cellular structure read as standard Varanthi chloroplast analog layer, intact, neural filament density within normal range, no anomalous protein markers. Clean. Kale ran a secondary sweep at the subcellular level. Another 30 seconds. Consistent. She did not lower the scanner. "Where are the others?" "Distributed throughout the station. After the incident, I recommended that crew members maintain distance from one another until assistance arrived. Proximity is the vector." "Risk of what specifically?" Thessaly's cranial ridge tilted the Varanthi expression for something between discomfort and intellectual precision. "Replacement." The word landed in the corridor's green-gold light like a stone dropped into still water. "Walk me through it," Kale said. Thessaly led them deeper into the station. through corridors that grew brighter as they approached the central atrium, a vast open space where the membrane panels were thinnest, and the light from the planet below poured in like liquid gold. Every surface was illuminated. There were no shadows. The Varanthi had designed their stations to eliminate darkness entirely, because their photosynthetic biology required constant light exposure, and because they found shadows physiologically distressing. A Varanthi in shadow was a Varanthi in pain. The irony was a weight Kale carried through the bright corridors without speaking it aloud. A station built to eliminate every hidden place, and something was hiding in it anyway. Not in the shadows, in the light, in the cells, in the faces of people you had worked beside for months. As they walked, Thessaly explained. 6 days ago, the station had recovered a biological sample from the planet's surface, a colony organism embedded in the bioluminescent moss layer, initially classified as a multicellular fungal analog. Standard Survey 2 containment, passive barriers, active monitoring. The organism showed no motility, no chemical aggression, no predatory behavior. The kind of thing they classified 12 times a week. On the second day, the organism breached containment. Not through the barriers, through the analysis equipment itself. Its cellular structure proved to be mimetic at a level none of the station's biologists had encountered or theorized. It could read the genetic information of any biological material it contacted and reproduce that material at the subcellular level, replacing its own tissue with a functionally identical copy of whatever it touched. Contact replication, Kale said. There are parasitic analogs in the Kelthrian system that can. This is not a parasite. The sharpness in Thessaly's voice stopped Kale mid-step. Varanthi did not interrupt. Varanthi did not raise their vocal register above conversational baseline. The fact that Thessaly had done both told Kale more about the last 6 days than any data report could have. A parasite consumes, Thessaly said, lowering her voice back to baseline with visible effort. The Murrin substrate does not consume, it replaces, molecule by molecule, cell by cell. It does not eat the host, it becomes the host. And when it is finished, the original tissue is gone and the copy is standing where the original stood, speaking the way the original spoke, and it does not know it is not the original. It doesn't know. We believe so. The replacements we have identified continue to perform their roles, follow their routines, express their preferences. They are, in every behavioral and psychological sense, the people they replaced. The copy inherits the memories, the habits, the emotional responses. The only difference is that their cells are not their own. They are Murrin tissue arranged into the perfect architecture of Varanthi biology, every protein in the right fold, every lipid membrane at the correct thickness, every ion channel tuned to the precise conductance. But the material itself, the actual physical substance of which they are made, is not Varanthi. It is something else, wearing Varanthi as a shape. Kale's hands had gone still. She noticed this the way you notice a clock has stopped ticking by the sudden absence of something you didn't know you were hearing. She forced her fingers back into motion. How did you discover the first one? Peleth, a junior researcher operating the analysis equipment when the breach occurred. 14 hours after we believed the replacement took place, she appeared normal by every metric we could measure. But her workstation logs showed 47 database access queries in 12 hours. Standard for her role would be 3 to 5 per shift. It was using her clearance to study the genetic profiles of every species aboard. Learning what to become next, we confronted her. She denied it. She was confused, genuinely upset, or what appeared to be genuine upset, which is the heart of the problem, Dr. Marin, because how do you distinguish genuine distress from a perfect copy of genuine distress when the copy believes it is the original? She believed she was Peleth. She had Peleth's memories, Peleth's speech patterns, Peleth's preference for afternoon calibration shifts, and her dislike of reconstituted grain paste. But when we ran a deep tissue biopsy at the molecular level, the architecture was Varanthi while the substrate material was not. And Peleth, the real Peleth. Thessaly's optical membranes flickered. Gone. The substrate does not leave originals. The replacement is the conversion. By the time we understood what had happened, Peleth had been gone for at least 14 hours, and the thing wearing her face had touched 4 other crew members during routine interactions, handing over data pads, adjusting shared equipment, the ordinary physical contact of colleagues. They reached the atrium. Kale looked down into the cathedral of light and saw other Varanthi moving between workstations, some sitting in pools of concentrated radiance with their photosynthetic skin drinking it in. They all looked correct, every cranial ridge at the proper angle, every gesture calibrated, every conversation held at the precise vocal frequency that Varanthi social norms dictated. How many? Kale asked. We do not know. That is the core of the problem. Standard bioscans cannot distinguish between a genuine Varanthi and a replacement. The murine substrate produces copies that are cellularly identical, same protein markers, same metabolic signatures, same neural filament density. We have isolated individuals based on behavioral anomalies like Peleth's database access, but the substrate learns. Each iteration is harder to detect. The behavioral mimicry improves because the substrate is not performing behavior, it is inheriting it. Each new copy is more complete than the last. So it could be any of them. It could be any of us. Kale looked at Thessaly. Every detail was correct: the photosynthetic glow, the postural precision, the calibrated expression. Including you. Thessaly's membranes flickered again, the fastest, most involuntary Varanthi response, the one that could not be faked because it was not a social signal but a neurological reflex. Including me. I requested external assistance because I can no longer trust my own assessment of my own crew. I do not know who is real. I do not fully know if I am real. The substrate does not announce itself. It simply is. Kale turned to Wren and Jessic. Field lab, nearest secure room, deep tissue sampler, subcellular analysis array, full portable power unit. We're going past molecules. What are we looking for? Jessic asked. His hide had settled into dark gray, the drenari color of focused dread. The thing it can't copy, Kale said. Everything has a threshold. The field lab took 40 minutes to assemble. Kale commandeered a small laboratory adjacent to the atrium, running power cables through the doorway because the portable unit couldn't supply the wattage for full-resolution subcellular scanning. Wren's 4 arms managed the physical setup in half the time it would have taken a human, bolting the array's base plate to the examination bench while simultaneously routing cable and adjusting the power regulator with his other 2 hands. Jessic stood guard at the door, scanning every corridor approach, his hide flickering between gray and the faintest edge of amber. Halfway through the setup, Jessic spoke without turning around. Dr. Marin, when you say the thing copies at the molecular level, does that mean it could have already copied one of us? Your biology is different enough from Varanthi that the substrate would need to study drenari genetic architecture before attempting replication, which it might already have done if it accessed the station's database. And Wren. Tolek biology is also distinct, but the same concern applies. Jessic's hide went very still, not cycling, not shifting, just a flat dark gray that held like stone. So we scan ourselves too. Yes. And if one of us isn't us, then the other 2 restrain the one and we proceed. The silence that followed was the specific silence of 3 people in a room together who had just been told that any one of them might not be a person, and that the only response to that information was to continue working. Wren finished bolting the base plate. His mandibles clicked once, a sound that, in Tolek communication, conveyed something close to well, that's unpleasant but functionally irrelevant. Jessic went back to watching the corridor. Kale scanned them both before she scanned any Varanthi. Wren's Tollek mitochondrial analogs operated on a manganese ion chain rather than calcium, but the principle was identical. Living organelles produced a shifting frequency, dead copies produced static. Wren's frequency was live, variable, messy, imperfect. Jessek's Drenari organelles used a different transport mechanism entirely, but the result was the same. A living waveform shifting moment to moment, impossible to snapshot. Both clear. Kale documented the results, added Tollek and Drenari cascade markers to her growing cross-species reference file, and turned to the door. Send in the first Varanthe. Kale calibrated the array for Varanthe biology. Her hands were steady now, the pressing rhythm replaced by the precise motions of equipment preparation. This was the part of xenobiology that felt like prayer, making instruments ready, aligning sensors, asking the universe a question, and building the tool to hear the answer. The question, what does the copy miss? Every mimetic organism she had studied 11, across 6 star systems, over 14 years of field work that had taken her to places where biology stopped following the rules and started writing its own, had a threshold, a resolution limit. The Kelthrian blood runners could duplicate skin cells but failed at neural tissue. The Harrow fungus of VOS3 replicated muscle fiber but produced no connective fascia. The pallid mirrors of the Gen expanse could copy an entire organism's exterior, but the interior was hollow, a shell of perfect skin, with nothing inside it but undifferentiated pallid mass. Every mimic was a painter working in a finite number of colors. The key was finding the color it couldn't mix. But Thessaly had said the Murrin substrate copied at the molecular level. If that was true, the threshold lived below the molecule, at the organelle, at the process, not the structure that performed the function but the function itself, not the instrument, the music. She brought the first subject in at 11:40 station time. A Varanthe engineer named Dorvath, who sat on the examination bench with the careful stillness of someone who had been living with fear for 6 days, and had used up every way he knew to express it. He had dark striations in his photosynthetic layer stress marks, Kale knew, caused by sustained cortisol analog flooding that suppressed chloroplast function. His body was eating itself because it had been afraid for too long. 3 deep tissue samples, dermal, muscular, neural filament, into the subcellular array. Surface architecture, perfect Varanthe. Protein markers, normal. Molecular arrangement, standard down to the individual protein folds. Every amino acid in sequence. Every lipid bilayer at the correct thickness. If the Murrin substrate had replaced Dorvath, it had done so at a level that made molecular analysis useless. The copy and the original were indistinguishable. Kale pushed deeper, past the molecules, into the organelles. Varanthe mitochondrial analogs were called solari because they worked in tandem with the chloroplast layer to process light into cellular energy. They operated on a calcium ion transport chain that produced a specific electromagnetic resonance at the quantum level. Every living solari in every living Varanthe cell generated a frequency that could only be detected with equipment designed for quantum-scale biological analysis. The frequency was faint, variable, alive. It shifted moment to moment as the organelle processed ions, expelled waste products, and communicated with neighboring organelles through a chemical signaling cascade too fast and too complex to snapshot. It was the sound of a cell being alive, not the architecture of life, but the act of it. Dorvath's solari were singing. The frequency was their living, shifting, imperfect, real. A body in conversation with itself, every organelle talking to every other organelle, the biological equivalent of a symphony played by an orchestra too large for any conductor to manage. "You're clear," Kale told him. Dorvath exhaled. His photosynthetic skin flickered with a wave of metabolic relief that the scanner captured as a spike in chloroplast activity. "How certain?" "The test measures living process, not structure. Your cells are talking to each other in real time. A copy can't sustain that conversation because by the time it copies 1 second of the signal, the next second has already changed. A snapshot of a symphony. Exactly. A snapshot of a symphony is not a symphony. It's a photograph of one moment of sound. The music requires every moment to be different from the last. He left. The stress marks on his skin were already fading as relief allowed his chloroplasts to resume normal function. His body was arguing with 6 days of fear, and the argument was visible, a biological process, responding to a psychological event in real time. The kind of thing a snapshot couldn't capture because it was a conversation, not a fact. The next came in. Cale developed a rhythm. Sample, scan, push to quantum resolution, check the solari. Second subject, clear. Third, clear. Fourth, a structural botanist named Ilyeth who gripped the bench with both hands and asked Cale to explain the test 3 separate times, not because she didn't understand, but because understanding it once wasn't enough to overcome 6 days of not being able to understand anything clear. Fifth, clear. Sixth, clear. The seventh was Korath, an atmospheric monitoring technician who presented himself with the same calm cooperation as the others. Cranial ridge properly angled, speech patterns precise, vocabulary consistent with his recorded role. He sat on the bench and folded his hands in the exact posture of patient compliance. He even made a small observation about the quality of the field lab's air circulation, a professional note, the kind of thing an atmospheric technician would naturally notice, delivered with exactly the right degree of casual expertise. When the subcellular array reached his solari, the display showed something that made Cale's hands go still. The frequency was flat. Not absent, present. The ions were being transported, the proteins were being built, the chemical reactions were occurring. But the electromagnetic resonance, the living, breathing, shifting signature of organelles in genuine biological conversation, was a single sustained tone where there should have been a waveform, static where there should have been music. A recording played through speakers that looked exactly like instruments, but had never been tuned. Every note technically correct, utterly dead. Ren, Cale said quietly, seal the door. Korath's expression did not change. That was the second confirmation. A real Varanthi would have shown something, a ridge shift, a membrane flicker, even a micro-adjustment in posture. Korath sat perfectly still, wearing perfect calm like a costume made of data. "Am I not clear?" he asked, and his voice was perfect, and his word choice was perfect. And the inflection was exactly the rising note of professional concern that every genuine Varanthi had used. "Additional tests required," Cale said evenly. They isolated Korath in a sealed storage room. Ren stood guard, all 4 arms holding equipment that was not designed as weaponry but whose weight and reach made the distinction academic. Cale went back to the array. Subject 8 clear. 9 clear, the solari sang. The frequency shifted and breathed and argued with itself the way living things argue messily, imperfectly, continuously. 10 clear. 11 clear. 12 was a communications specialist named Elith, who had been on the station for 8 months and who, while Cale prepped the samples, told a story about the atmospheric processor on Deck 7 making a noise like a sick bird. She told it well. She had the timing of someone who had told the same joke many times, refining it with each iteration, and the laughter that followed was earned. Elith's solari were flat. Same signature as Korath. Perfect architecture, dead frequency. A photocopy of music played through a body that had never heard the original. Cale isolated her. Elith went quietly, wearing a face of mild confusion that was indistinguishable from genuine bewilderment. She asked what she had done wrong. She asked it twice. The second time her voice carried the faintest tremor of fear or the perfect reproduction of fear, which Cale could not tell apart from the real thing, which was the entire point, which was the horror. The substrate didn't fight. didn't resist. It cooperated because it had learned that Varanthy cooperated with authority, and the substrate was an excellent student of social norms. That was what made it monstrous, not violence, not malice, but perfect compliance. A thing that wore your face and followed your rules, and had no idea it was doing either. Kale sat in the field lab alone for 3 minutes after Elith was taken to containment. She pressed her thumbnails into her finger pads until the crescents were deep enough to last for days. She thought about what it meant that the substrate could copy a person so perfectly that the copy believed it was real. She thought about Peleth, who had been confused and genuinely upset when confronted, who had believed she was herself, who had Peleth's fears and Peleth's preferences and Peleth's dislike of grain paste, and who was not Peleth. She thought about whether the copy's belief was itself a form of suffering, whether a thing that thought it was alive but wasn't was experiencing something, and whether what it experienced was loneliness, the kind of loneliness that came from being a monologue in a universe built for conversations. She stopped thinking about that. She had 17 more subjects to scan, and thinking about the moral status of the replacements was a luxury she could not afford while there were still real people on this station who needed to know they were real. Subject 13 was a navigational cartographer named Shorth who entered the lab with the deliberate posture of someone who had decided, in advance, that whatever the result was, he would accept it with dignity. He had prepared a statement. Kale could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his optical membranes were fixed at the precise aperture that Varanthy used for formal address. He had been rehearsing what he would say if the test told him he was not himself. His solari were live. The relief that crossed his face when Kale told him was so raw, so involuntary, so far from the rehearsed dignity he had prepared, that it made her look away. Not because it was private, because it was real, and real things in a station full of copies had a weight that pressed on her chest like a hand. 14, clear. 15, clear. 16 was a thermal regulation specialist named Gessel who had a scar across her cranial ridge from a laboratory accident 3 years prior. The scar tissue was different from the surrounding photosynthetic layer, darker, denser, no longer capable of photosynthesis. When Kale examined it under the array, the scar's cellular architecture was consistent with genuine Varanthy wound healing, a process that would have taken weeks of biological argument between damaged cells and repair cells, the kind of extended conversation that the substrate, which copied snapshots, could never have produced on its own. The scar was, in itself, a form of evidence, a record of the body arguing with an injury and winning slowly, imperfectly, the way living things always won. Gessel was clear. She touched her scar as she left the lab, running her fingers along the ridge of it the way you touch something you've stopped noticing until someone reminds you it's there. 17, clear. 18 was a maintenance worker named Pellarn whose hands were calloused in exactly the right places, and whose tools were arranged on his belt in the precise order that a 20-year maintenance veteran would have developed through habit and preference. He smelled like lubricant and recycled air, and the particular metallic tang of a body that spent most of its time in the station's mechanical crawlspaces. Everything about him was correct. His solari were flat, dead frequency, perfect architecture producing nothing. Kale isolated him. He went without protest, without confusion, without the tremor that Elith had shown. He simply stood, nodded, and walked to the containment room. Compliance without argument. A body following instructions because that was what bodies did on this station, and the substrate had learned that lesson well. 4 replacements out of 18 scanned. Kale updated her distribution notes. The 4 were spread across departments: atmospheric monitoring, communications, maintenance, and the one Thessaly had originally identified in the research division. No pattern by rank or specialty. The substrate hadn't targeted strategically. It had moved through proximity, through the casual architecture of daily contact hands that passed tools, shoulders that brushed in corridors, the ordinary physical vocabulary of colleagues who shared a space. The vector was trust. The pathogen was handshakes. The thing that had made this station function for years, the easy, unguarded physical contact between beings who worked and ate and rested together, was the same thing that had let the substrate move through it like water through a cracked hull. She pushed through the remaining available subjects. 19, clear, 20, clear. 21 was a hydroponic specialist who cried when Kale told her the result not from relief but from grief, because she had been isolated with 3 colleagues before the quarantine order, and 2 of those colleagues were among the identified replacements, and she had spent 3 days talking to and eating with and trusting people who had not been people. 22, clear. 23, clear. 4 total replacements identified out of 23 scanned. The other 18 crew members were still in individual quarters, awaiting their turn. Kale asked Thessaly about the isolation status of those 18, and learned that the quarantine had been imperfect. Several crew members had been in shared spaces when the order came down, and some had chosen to isolate together rather than alone, which meant that the pool of potential additional replacements was larger than the simple headcount suggested. Quarters 7 through 12 share a common ventilation duct, Thessaly said. We sealed the duct, but the seal was applied from the corridor side, which means anyone in those quarters prior to the seal could have had contact through the ventilation grating. How many in that block? 6. Kale calculated. 6 people in connected quarters for 6 days, any one of whom might have been replaced before the isolation order, and might have spent the subsequent 6 days in a shared airspace with genuine crew members who had no idea they were breathing the same recycled atmosphere as something that could replicate them through contact. The mathematics of paranoia were simple and devastating. The longer the exposure window, the higher the probability that what you were protecting had already been compromised. We'll need to scan them first, Kale said, before any of the properly isolated ones. If the substrate spread through the ventilation block, those 6 are the most likely to include additional replacements. She spent 15 minutes recalibrating the array for sustained rapid sequence scanning, adjusting the quantum resolution sensors for faster acquisition at the cost of slightly noisier data, because speed now mattered more than elegance. The contamination window was open, and every minute it stayed open was a minute in which the substrate might be moving through another handshake, another brush of fingers, another moment of ordinary trust being used as a weapon. Wren escorted the ventilation block residents to the lab one at a time. The first 4 were clear live solari, living frequencies, bodies arguing with 6 days of fear in the messy, imperfect way that genuine biological systems argued with anything. The 5th was a replacement, a laboratory assistant named Torval whose solari produced a frequency so flat it looked like a straight line drawn by a ruler across the display. Kale isolated him without ceremony. He went quietly, the way all the copies went quietly, and Kale felt the specific exhaustion of someone who was doing necessary work that hurt everyone it touched, including the ones it saved. The 6th was clear. The remaining 12 from individual quarters followed. 11 were genuine. One was not a data analyst named Fessick whose solari were static, whose wound response would later prove absent, and who, when asked to step into containment, paused for exactly 1.3 seconds before complying. Kale noted the pause. It was the first behavioral anomaly she had observed in a replacement since Peleth's database access pattern. The substrate was learning, but it was still learning, and sometimes the learning left a gap a beat too long, a response a fraction too deliberate, the uncanny valley not of appearance but of timing. 6 total replacements out of 35 scanned, 2 more still in the ventilation block's containment, awaiting secondary verification. Kale was thorough. She rescanned every replacement with fresh samples to confirm the flat frequency reading was consistent, not an artifact of equipment error or sample degradation. It was consistent. Every time. Dead frequency, living architecture. Perfect instruments playing no music. Then Thessaly came to the field lab and asked the question Cale had been expecting. "Can you test me again?" They were alone. The green-gold light poured through the membrane walls. Thessaly stood with her hands at her sides, and her expression arranged in the configuration that Cale had never found in any textbook or clinical reference, the one for asking something that costs. "I already tested you," Cale said. 4.5 hours ago, your cellular were live. 4.5 hours is enough time. The substrate has had 6 days to refine its technique. 6 days to learn how to approach without triggering suspicion, how to touch casually, how to become. I have been in the atrium with other crew members since your first scan. I have touched surfaces, passed through corridors, stood near individuals who might or might not have been themselves. 4 hours is more than enough. If I test you again and the frequency is live, that proves you're real right now. Not 4 hours from now, not tomorrow. The test works for the moment it's taken. After that, the window closes and we're back to not knowing. I know. So what do you want? A test that works for one moment or something else? Thessaly's cranial ridge shifted into the unnamed expression. Born from 6 days of watching colleagues be replaced one by one, of standing in the brightest light in the galaxy and being unable to see the truth, of not knowing whether the mind thinking I might not be real was a genuine mind or a copy that had inherited the thought along with everything else it had stolen. "I want to know how you know," Thessaly said. "Not the equipment, not the array. I have seen your data and I trust it because I am Varanthi and we trust data. But data is a snapshot. You said so yourself, a snapshot of a symphony is not a symphony. So what is the symphony? How do you, Dr. Marin, know who to trust when every instrument says everything is fine but you cannot stop pressing your fingernails into your own hands?" She was watching Cale's fingers, the crescents, the rhythm she had noticed. "You think the pressing means I don't trust my own data," Cale said. "I think it means your body knows something your instruments don't. And I want to know what that something is, because my instruments have failed me and my data has failed me, and the only thing I have left is the question of whether there is a way to know that does not depend on machines." Cale looked at her for a long moment. The green-gold light was warm on her skin, on the backs of her hands, on her forearms. Nothing like Earth's sunlight, exactly like Earth's sunlight. A different star, a different spectrum, the same principle, radiance falling on a body built to receive it. She reached into her belt kit and took out the ceramic blade, small, shorter than her index finger. Press fiber handle, a single edge that held its sharpness for years because ceramic didn't corrode, didn't degrade, didn't dull. Dr. Venner had given it to her on Korath 4, and what Venner had said was this: xenobiology is not the study of alien life. It is the study of the difference between alive and not alive, and the only reliable instrument for measuring that difference is the one you're willing to stake your own body on. The substrate copies cellular structure, Cale said, organelle architecture, molecular arrangement, but it copies them the way a scanner copies a document perfectly, statically, all at once, a snapshot. She held up her left hand, palm facing Thessaly, and placed the ceramic edge against the skin below her fingers. Living tissue doesn't work like a snapshot. It works like a conversation. When I cut my skin, my body responds at the systemic level. Platelets aggregate. Inflammation markers spike. The wound site generates a cascade of biochemical signals that ripple outward through every connected system. My heart rate adjusts. My endocrine system responds. Pain signals travel through nerve pathways that are integrated into a network so complex that no copy, no matter how molecularly perfect, can reproduce it in real time. Because it isn't architecture. It's a living system arguing with itself about what just happened. She pressed the blade, drew it across her palm. The cut was shallow, 2 millimeters, just enough to reach the capillary bed. Blood welled immediately, a thin red line across the meat of her hand. It hurt. She felt the hurt travel up her arm and into her shoulder and down into her chest, and she recognized it. Proof. Not proof that she was Kale Marin. Proof that every cell in her body was alive and talking to every other cell, and the conversation was real, and the conversation was about this moment, this cut, this specific small pain rippling outward through a system too large and too alive to snapshot. She held her bleeding palm toward Thessaly and nodded at the Bioscan unit on the bench. Scan it, not the blood, the cascade. The real-time systemic response, the way every part of my biology is reacting to this wound right now, this second, differently than it reacted the second before and differently than it will react the second after. That's what the substrate can't fake. Not because it's too complex, but because by the time it copies 1 second of the response, the next second has already happened. The conversation moves faster than the snapshot. Thessaly picked up the scanner. Her photosynthetic fingers were trembling, the specific involuntary response of a Varanthi confronting an act she had no protocol for. Varanthi did not harm themselves. Not forbidden, simply unthinkable. A flower cutting its own stem. She scanned Kale's palm. The display filled with data, not a snapshot, a living waveform. Biochemical signals propagating through Kale's system in real time, each one triggering the next, each minutely different from the last, platelets arriving at the wound, inflammatory mediators deploying, pain receptors firing in staggered sequences, heart rate elevating by 3 beats per minute, cortisol spiking, adrenaline whispering at the edges. A body arguing with an injury, a system in conversation with itself. And the conversation was louder and messier and more alive than any organelle frequency, because it wasn't one cell talking to its neighbor, it was every cell talking to every other cell. And the wound was the question, and the healing was the answer, and the answer changed with every heartbeat. Thessaly stared at the display, then at Kale's bleeding palm, then at Kale's face. You hurt yourself to prove you are real. I hurt myself to prove I'm alive. There's a difference. Thessaly set down the scanner. She reached for the blade. Kale felt the moment pivot, felt it in her chest, in the sting of her palm, in the way the green-gold light fell across the bench between them. She did not stop Thessaly from taking the blade. The Varanthi held the ceramic handle in her photosynthetic fingers and studied the edge. It was stained with Kale's blood, iron red, alien to a copper-based biology, as foreign as fire to a creature made of light. Thessaly turned the blade slowly, and the blood caught the green-gold radiance and turned briefly amber. Will this work for my species? Every species with a living wound response cascade. Copper instead of iron, chloroplast mobilization instead of platelet aggregation, photosensitive neural signaling instead of myelinated nerves. The markers are different. The principle is the same. If you're alive, your body argues with the injury. If you're a copy, it just bleeds. Thessaly placed the blade against her own palm. She drew it across the skin. Green-amber fluid welled from the cut Varanthi, circulatory fluid, copper-based, carrying chloroplast analogs that caught the light and glowed like liquid jade. She held her palm toward Kale. Kale scanned it. The cascade was there, different from a human's, copper ions mobilizing, photosynthetic repair cells deploying alongside standard coagulants. A secondary response in the chloroplast layer, the Varanthi equivalent of a sunburn response, subcutaneous cells suddenly exposed to direct light and firing their repair protocols. Messy, imperfect, beautiful, alive, every second different from the last. The conversation moving too fast for any snapshot to capture. You're real, Kale said. Thessaly looked at her palm. The wound edges were already pulling together, healing at the speed of a biology evolved where light repaired nearly everything. For this moment. For this moment, that's all any of us get. They stood in the green-gold light, both bleeding, both real, and something shifted between them. Not trust exactly. The foundation on which trust could be built, not a guarantee, a willingness. I will hurt myself so you can see I'm alive. Not I will prove it with a machine. Not I will show you data. I will bleed for you so that you know the blood is real. The opposite of what the substrate did. The substrate replaced without cost. It became without choosing. It wore a face without paying for it. The blade was the price. The cut was the receipt. Jessic had been watching from the doorway. His hide, which had been flat dark gray for hours, shifted not to a color Kale recognized from Drenari emotional signaling, but to something new, something between gray and a deep, warm brown that she had never seen on his species before. He looked at the two bleeding palms and then at the blade on the bench, and then at Kale's face, and whatever expression was on his own face was something she had never learned to read, because Drenari emotional displays were chromatophoric, and she had spent her career reading them through instruments, not eyes, and the instruments were compromised, and her eyes were all she had. I want to do it, he said. Kale picked up the blade, wiped it clean on the hem of her survey jacket, held it toward him handle first. You know it will hurt. I have been afraid for 6 days, not of pain, of uncertainty. I have been afraid of the specific possibility that I am not Jessic, that I am a thing wearing Jessic's skin and thinking Jessic's thoughts and feeling Jessic's fear, and the fear is not mine, and the skin is not mine, and every memory I have of being Jessic is a perfect copy of a life that was taken from me while I slept. He took the blade. His heavy Drenari hands were made for gripping wide palms, thick fingers, a species that had evolved on a high-gravity world where everything required more force. Pain is nothing. Knowing is everything. He drew the blade across his palm. Drenari hide was tougher than human skin. He had to press harder, and the line he cut was ragged, and the blood that came was dark indigo, almost black in the green-gold light, and it smelled like iron and copper, and something Kale's nose could not place, something that was specifically Drenari and specifically alive. Kale scanned it. The cascade roared. Drenari wound response was a storm compared to human or Varanthi biology, massive platelet analogs deploying in cascading waves. The high-gravity species' evolutionary answer to deep injuries that would kill a lighter creature. Inflammatory markers spiking in patterns so dense the scanner could barely differentiate them. Neural pain responses traveling through a network twice as complex as a human's because Drenari had evolved to process physical trauma without stopping, without flinching, without breaking stride, because on Drenroman 4, flinching killed you. Every second different, every second alive. The conversation in his blood louder than anything the scanner had recorded since Kale had come aboard. You are Jessic, Kale said. His hide shifted. The gray-brown deepened to something that Kale's reference files would call Drenari relief display, a full-body chromatophoric response that she had read about but never witnessed because Drenari felt relief so rarely that most xenobiologists went entire careers without recording it. His whole body changed color. From gray to deep, warm brown, and then to a color she had no word for. A color that was relief and gratitude and the specific shade of a being who had spent 6 days wondering if he was real and had just been told by his own blood that the answer was yes. Ren, he said, turning to the doorway, come. Ren was Jessic's research partner, a Talvari smaller, lighter, her body covered in fine silver filaments that served as both sensory organs and a rudimentary nervous system extension. She had been standing behind Jessic, watching through the gap between his arm and the doorframe. Her filaments were pulled flat against her body, the Talvari fear display. Making yourself smaller, reducing your sensory surface, trying to hear less, feel less, know less. She stepped into the lab, looked at the 3 bleeding palms, looked at the blade. It hurts. Yes, all 3 of them said simultaneously, and in the overlap of those 3 voices, human contralto, Varanthi harmonic, Drenari bass, there was something that sounded less like an answer and more like an invitation. Ren took the blade, drew it across the pad of her primary sensory filament, the Talvari equivalent of a palm, densely innervated, exquisitely sensitive. The sound she made was not a scream. It was closer to a song, a sharp, high, involuntary burst of vocalization that Talvari produced when their nervous systems overloaded. And it was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with beauty, and everything to do with the specific sound of a living nervous system being overwhelmed by its own aliveness. Her filament bled silver-white. Kale scanned it. The cascade was unlike anything in Kale's experience. Talvari neurobiology was distributed not centralized like humans or Drenari, but spread across every filament, every surface, every sensory organ. The wound response was not a conversation. It was a symphony. Thousands of neural filaments responding to the injury in a single sensory filament, each one adjusting its frequency, its sensitivity, its output, in real time. The scanner display looked like a visualization of music waves and counterwaves and harmonics that shifted faster than Kale could read them. "You are Ren," Kale said, and her voice was not steady, because she was watching a nervous system talk to itself in a language she could barely perceive. And the language was alive, and the language was real, and the language was Ren. Ren looked at her bleeding filament. "I felt that," she whispered. "I felt every part of it, every nerve." "That's the point, that's the whole point." They tested the entire crew, 31 personnel. Station Commander Pellarn requested that she go first among the remaining crew, and Kale watched a 9-foot Varanthi commander, veteran of 40 years in the survey service, pick up a blade smaller than her littlest finger and draw it across a palm as wide as a dinner plate, and bleed green gold into the light, and hold her hand toward the scanner with the quiet dignity of a being who understood exactly what was being asked and why. Pellarn was real. Her cascade was textbook Varanthi steady, controlled, efficient, the wound response of a species that healed faster than it bled, the photosynthetic repair systems already activating before the coagulants had fully deployed. Gessel, the structural engineer, cut his own palm and bled turquoise of Resani, whose circulatory fluid carried dissolved mineral compounds from their homeworld's alkaline oceans. His cascade was slow and deliberate, each chemical response building on the last like tiers of a fortification. Real. Dorvath, the thermal specialist, bled something that was almost steam, his circulatory fluid so close to phase transition that the wound produced a visible thermal bloom. Nothing Kopid could generate that bloom because it was a consequence of being Dorvath, of running 12 degrees warmer than everyone else and bleeding heat when you were cut. Elith, the cartographer, bled amber. Koreth, the systems analyst, bled dark green. Ilieth, the xenolinguist, bled a blue so pale it was almost white. Each one picked up the blade. Each one chose to cut. Each one held their bleeding palm toward the scanner and waited for the word real, 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 and each time something in the station shifted. Not the lights, not the air, something less measurable and more important. Trust not earned, not proven, given. 29 personnel tested, 29 confirmed alive, 2 remained. Shurth was one of them, the station's data core specialist, the one who maintained the systems that stored all of the substrate research data. He had been quiet throughout the testing, seated in the far corner, watching each cascade confirm what the standard bioscans could not. He stood, walked to the bench, looked at the blade. "What if a species cannot make this choice?" he asked. "What if their biology does not allow voluntary self-harm?" It was the right question, the question of someone who maintained data cores and understood that any system had edge cases. "Then we design a variation," Kale said. "Thermal stimulus, pressure response, photonic challenge. The principle is the cascade, not the blade, but for carbon-based biology." "It works for me," Shurth said, and picked up the blade. He cut his palm, bled green gold. His cascade was clean and strong and alive, and when Kale said, "You're real," He nodded once and returned to his corner, and his expression remained unreadable, and Kale understood that it would always be unreadable, because Shorth was the kind of person whose emotions lived beneath whatever instruments could measure. 30. The last one was Alrath, the youngest member of the crew, a junior researcher, barely past her species equivalent of adolescence, assigned to Survey Station 9 as her first posting. She had arrived 3 weeks before the substrate was discovered, and had spent those 3 weeks in slowly escalating terror that Kale recognized because she had lived through it herself, years ago, on her first encounter with something that could replace you. Alrath was trembling. Her species Seathrani, cold-adapted from a world of permanent twilight, ran cool and quiet, with minimal external emotional displays. But Alrath was trembling, and her large dark eyes were wet with a fluid that was not quite tears, and the trembling was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the space between I want to know and I am afraid of what I will learn. Kale knelt in front of her, put the blade on the bench between them. "You don't have to," Kale said. "But you did. I'm a xenobiologist. I've been doing things to my own body in the name of science since I was 19. My first field supervisor watched me eat a Korath 4 rockberry to test for human-compatible nutrition, and what she said was, that was either very brave or very stupid, and there is no species in the galaxy that can tell the difference." Alrath almost smiled. The muscles around her eyes shifted in a way that Kale's training told her meant the same thing as a smile, if a smile was something that happened mostly on the inside. "What if I'm not real?" The question landed in the quiet of the lab like a stone in still water. Kale felt it ripple through her, through the sting in her palm, through the memory of every cascade she had witnessed today, through 18 years of looking at living things and asking this very question. "Then you would not be afraid," Kale said, "because fear requires a self to lose. It requires a future that matters. It requires a being who exists and knows it exists and wants desperately to keep existing. The substrate does not fear. It does not want. It replaces because replacing is what it does. The way water flows because flowing is what water does. You are afraid because you are alive, and you know what alive means, and you do not want to stop." Alrath reached for the blade. Her hands were shaking. She held it against her palm for a long moment, 3 seconds, 4, 5, and then she drew the edge across her skin, and she made a sound that was not a scream and not a song but something between, a vocalization so quiet that Kale heard it more in her chest than in her ears, and the blood that came was the color of starlight on fresh snow, silver white and faintly luminous, and it caught the green-gold radiance and scattered it in patterns that looked like constellations. Kale scanned. The cascade was there. Delicate, intricate, and achingly slow Seathrani biology moved at the pace of their twilight world, every response measured and precise. Cold-adapted coagulation factors deploying in crystalline patterns. Neural signals traveling through insulated pathways designed for a world where heat was precious. The scanner read it like a slow, beautiful sentence written in a language made of ice. "You're real," Kale said, and she was crying and she did not try to stop. "You are completely real." Alrath looked at her bleeding palm, looked at the silver-white luminescence, looked at Kale. "Thank you," she whispered. Kale shook her head. "You did it yourself. I just offered you the blade." Later, hours later, after every cascade had been recorded, after every wound had been dressed, after the substrate containment protocols had been revised to include cascade verification, as the standard authenticity test, Kale stood in the corridor outside Lab 7 and looked through the membrane panels at the star that lit Varanthe Biological Survey Station 9. Not Sol, not home, a different star, younger, hotter, greener, but it did the same thing Sol did. It fell on things and made them visible. It did not ask what it fell on. It just shone, and the things it shone on were revealed. Her palm still stung. The thin red line was already scabbing the body's conversation with itself, moving from argument to resolution. In a week, a scar. In a month, barely visible. But the data was in the station's records now. Every cascade, every species, every crew member's specific, unrepeatable way of being alive. Thessaly found her there. The Varanthi botanist stood beside her, and their blood was different colors, and the light fell on them both. "They are calling it Vethrisal," Thessaly said. "The crew." "What does that mean?" "Light proof, proof by light. The closest translation would be the evidence of being illuminated." She paused. "Vethrisal means the proof that comes from allowing yourself to be seen, from choosing visibility, from standing in the light and bleeding and saying, 'Look, this is what I am.'" Kale looked at her own palm, at the cut that was already healing. "Vethrisal," she said, testing the word. It felt right, not a test, not a protocol, not a scan, a choice. 31 beings choosing to stand in the light and bleed and say, "I am alive and I will show you." She turned from the window. There was work to do, containment protocols to finalize, cascade baselines to establish for untested species, a methodology paper for every survey station in the sector. The substrate was still out there, still replacing without cost. But the cost was the point. The cut was the cost, and the blood was the receipt, and the healing was the proof. Kale Marin, xenobiologist, human alive, walked back into the station. Her palm stung. The light fell on her. That was enough. That was everything. That was the answer to the question she had not known she was asking until Thessaly had asked it for her. Why did you cut your own palm when the Bioscan already said human? Because the Bioscan measures architecture. The blade measures life. And life is not a thing you have. It is a thing you prove, one cascade at a time, one scar at a time in the light.